There are moments in life when the past refuses to remain buried, when memories surface like whispers in the wind, carrying with them the weight of what could have been. I've lived with such a moment for over 3 decades now, a ghost that haunts my quieter evenings and fills my solitary mornings with questions that have no answers. Her name was Sarah, and she was supposed to be my forever. The apartment feels too large these days, echoing with silence where laughter once filled every corner. I pour my morning coffee and stare out at the city below, watching couples walk hand in hand on the sidewalk, their lives intertwined in ways mine never managed to be. At 72, I've grown accustomed to solitude, but some wounds never fully heal, and some loves never truly fade, no matter how many years pass between then and now. It was 1987 when I first placed that ring on her finger. Not an engagement ring, but something more personal, more us. A simple silver band with a small sapphire, her birthstone, that I'd saved months to buy on my teacher's salary. We were 25 then, young and foolish enough to believe that love alone could conquer any obstacle. I remember the way her eyes lit up when I slipped it onto her ring finger, how she whispered that she'd never take it off. Life, however, had different plans. Her father's job transfer to another state, my stubborn pride that prevented me from following, and a series of misunderstandings that grew into an insurmountable wall between us. The letters stopped coming after 6 months, and I convinced myself it was better this way. But I never stopped wondering what became of Sarah, never stopped hoping that somewhere out there she remembered what we had shared during those magical 2 years. Last week, everything changed when I received a phone call that would shatter the carefully constructed peace I'd built around my solitary existence. It was Margaret, Sarah's cousin, someone I hadn't spoken to in 20 years. Her voice carried news that would send me spiraling back to 1987, to a love story that I thought had ended but had apparently continued in ways I never imagined possible. Margaret's words still ring in my ears. She never stopped talking about you, Thomas, even after all these years. The conversation lasted 2 hours, filled with revelations that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about how our story had ended. Sarah had married, yes, a good man named Robert, whom she'd met 5 years after our separation. They'd built a life together, raised 2 children, celebrated anniversaries, and created all the memories that should have been ours. But here's what haunts me. According to Margaret, Sarah wore that silver ring every single day of her 40-year marriage. Not on her ring finger, that belonged to Robert and the vows they'd shared, but on a delicate chain around her neck, hidden beneath her clothing, close to her heart. She'd told Margaret once, during a particularly vulnerable moment, that some loves are too precious to abandon completely, even when life demands you choose a different path. The revelation sent me reeling through decades of assumption and acceptance. I'd spent 37 years believing that our love had been a youthful folly, easily forgotten and replaced by more mature relationships. I'd convinced myself that I was the only one carrying this torch, the only one whose heart had refused to let go completely. The knowledge that Sarah had carried a piece of our love with her every day changed everything I thought I understood about my own life. Margaret painted a picture of a woman who'd lived fully and loved deeply, but who'd never quite shaken the ghost of what might have been. Sarah had been happy in her marriage, truly happy, but there had always been a shadow of wistfulness when certain songs played on the radio, or when she passed jewelry stores and caught sight of sapphire rings in the window displays. The most devastating detail came near the end of our conversation, when Margaret mentioned that Sarah had passed away 3 months ago after a brief battle with cancer. She'd been buried with that silver ring clasped in her hands, a final acknowledgement of a love that had survived 4 decades, marriage, children, grandchildren, and all the beautiful complications that fill a well-lived life. Sleep became impossible after Margaret's call. I found myself pacing the apartment at 3 in the morning, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd learned. Sarah hadn't just remembered our love, she'd carried it with her like a sacred talisman, honoring it even while building a life with someone else. The complexity of her feelings, the depth of her loyalty to multiple loves, painted a portrait of a woman far more nuanced than the girl I'd known at 25. I began to understand that love isn't always about possession or exclusivity. Sarah had loved Robert completely and honestly, building a family and sharing decades of joy with him. But she'd also maintained a space in her heart for what we'd shared, not as competition to her marriage, but as a separate, equally valid part of her emotional landscape. The ring around her neck had been her way of honoring both loves without betraying either. The thought of her touching that chain during quiet moments, remembering our stolen afternoons in the park or the way we dance in her tiny apartment kitchen, filled me with a bittersweet ache. She'd lived with our ghost just as I had, but she'd found a way to make peace with it, to let it coexist with the life she'd chosen. I envied her that wisdom, that ability to hold multiple truths simultaneously without being paralyzed by them. Margaret had mentioned that Robert knew about the ring. He'd asked about it early in their marriage, and Sarah had told him the truth, that it represented a love from her past that had helped shape who she was, but that it in no way diminished what she felt for him. Remarkably, he'd understood, even encouraging her to wear it when he noticed her touching her throat during particularly emotional moments. The generosity of Robert's acceptance, the grace of Sarah's honesty, and the enduring power of a love that had found a way to exist alongside another love created a story more beautiful and complex than any Hollywood romance. But it also raised questions that would torment me in the days to come. What if I had known? Would it have changed how I lived my life? Could I have found my own way to honor our love while building something new? Margaret's revelations opened a floodgate of memories I'd carefully locked away for decades. I found myself pulling out old photo albums, letters I'd never thrown away, small mementos from our time together that I'd hidden in a shoebox in my bedroom closet. Looking at these artifacts of our love with new eyes, knowing that Sarah had been doing the same thing in her own way, created an intimacy across time and space that left me breathless. There was a particular photograph, Sarah laughing at something I'd said while we sat on a bench in Central Park, the silver ring clearly visible on her finger, that took on new meaning. She'd kept a copy of this same photo, Margaret told me, tucked inside her jewelry box, next to the chain that held my ring. For 40 years, we'd both been treasuring the same moment, the same captured second of pure joy, completely unaware of our parallel devotion. I began to piece together the story of Sarah's life through Margaret's memories and the details she shared about her cousin's quiet confessions over the years. Sarah had been a teacher too, elementary school, and she'd often wondered aloud what it would have been like if she and I had ended up in the same profession in the same city. She'd followed my career from a distance, Margaret revealed, knowing through mutual friends that I'd never married, never had children of my own. The knowledge that she'd kept track of my life while I'd deliberately avoided news about hers added another layer to this complex tapestry of enduring connection. She'd known about my promotion to principal, about the teaching awards I'd won, about my mother's death 5 years ago. She'd carried not just the memory of who I'd been, but an awareness of who I'd become, even as she built her own family and career hundreds of miles away. The question that haunted me now was whether this knowledge would bring peace or deeper anguish. Part of me felt grateful to finally understand that our love had been as meaningful to her as it had been to me, but another part grieved for all the years we'd both spent loving each other in silence, never knowing that the feeling was mutual, never having the chance to find closure or connection in our mature years. 3 days after Margaret's call, she contacted me again with news that would prove even more earth-shattering than her initial revelations. While helping Robert clear out Ra's personal belongings, she discovered a collection of letters in a locked drawer of Sarah's desk. 23 letters, written over 4 decades, all addressed to me. Letters Sarah had composed but never sent, pouring her heart onto paper in moments of particular loneliness or joy or confusion. Margaret asked if I wanted to read them. The question hung in the air between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was strong enough to cross. These letters represented Sarah's most private thoughts about our lost love, her unfiltered emotions about the path not taken. Did I have the right to read them? Did I have the strength to handle whatever truths they contained? After a sleepless night, I told Margaret yes, I needed to know. The first letter, dated just 6 months after our separation, arrived in my mailbox 3 days later. Sarah's handwriting, unchanged after all these years, filled 5 pages with raw emotion and desperate hope. She'd written about the loneliness of her new city, about dreams where we were still together, about the ring she touched whenever she missed her too much to bear. She'd wondered if I ever thought of her, if I regretted letting pride come between us. Reading her words from 1988 while sitting in my apartment in 2024 created a disorienting sense of time collapse. The young woman pouring her heart onto paper had no idea she would live another 36 years carrying this love. The old man reading her words had no idea that his own sleepless nights missing her had been matched by her own wakeful hours missing him. We'd been synchronized in our suffering, harmonized in our hope, completely unaware of our shared devotion. The subsequent letters, arriving one each day from Margaret, chronicled the evolution of Sarah's feelings as she met Robert, fell in love again, married, and started a family. But even in her happiest letters, describing her wedding day, the birth of her children, anniversaries, and family vacations, there were always paragraphs addressed to me, updates on how she was learning to love 2 men simultaneously without betraying either. The letter from Sarah's 5th wedding anniversary contained a passage that I've read dozens of times since receiving it. I've learned that the heart is far more expansive than we're taught to believe. Loving Robert doesn't diminish what I felt for you. It exists alongside it, in a completely different chamber of my soul. Some people would call this unfair to Robert, but I think it makes me love him more purely, because I understand now what it means to lose love, and I never take what I have with him for granted. Her wisdom about the nature of love challenged everything I'd believed about relationships and loyalty. I'd spent decades thinking that my inability to love anyone else the way I'd loved Sarah was a romantic dedication, a testament to the purity of our connection. But Sarah had found a way to honor our love while also creating space for new love, new joy, new possibilities. She'd been braver than I was, more open to the full spectrum of human emotion. The letters from her children's teenage years revealed a different kind of struggle. Sarah had worried that her secret devotion to my memory was somehow cheating her family of her complete presence. She'd written about therapy sessions where she explored whether carrying this torch was healthy or obsessive. The conclusion she'd reached, with professional help, was that our love had been formative and beautiful, and that honoring it didn't prevent her from being fully present for her chosen life. One particularly moving letter, written on what would have been our 20th anniversary if we'd stayed together, described a conversation Sarah had with her teenage daughter about first loves and heartbreak. She'd found herself sharing our story, not the intimate details, but the broad strokes of 2 young people who'd loved deeply but been separated by circumstances. Her daughter had asked if she regretted not fighting harder to stay together, and Sarah's response revealed the depth of her emotional maturity. I told her that some loves are meant to be lived and others are meant to be treasured, Sarah had written to me. Our love was meant to be treasured. It taught me how to love Robert, how to be vulnerable, how to trust my heart even after it had been broken. If we'd stayed together, we might have destroyed what we had with the ordinary struggles of daily life. By losing each other, we served something perfect and eternal. The most difficult letters to read were the ones Sarah had written during her pregnancies and early motherhood. She'd wondered, with the brutal honesty that only comes in private moments, what our children might have looked like, what kind of father I would have been, whether the love we'd shared would have translated into a successful family life. These weren't bitter thoughts, but rather the natural curiosity of someone living one life while remembering the possibility of another. She'd written about holding her newborn son and seeing something familiar in his features that reminded her of me, not because he was my child, but because love creates templates in our hearts that we recognize in unexpected places. She'd loved her children completely and without reservation, but she'd also allowed herself to grieve the children we'd never had together, the family unit that existed only in imagination and possibility. The letter written on her son's college graduation day contained a paragraph that brought tears to my eyes. I watched James walk across that stage today, and I felt overwhelming pride in the man he's become. But for just a moment, I allowed myself to wonder if you would have been proud too, if you'd been there in some alternate universe where we made different choices. I think you would have loved him, Thomas. He has your curiosity about the world and your gentle way with people who are struggling. Her daughter's wedding had prompted another letter filled with complex emotions. Sarah had helped her daughter choose a wedding dress and plan a ceremony, fully present for every joyful moment. But she'd also written to me about how the experience had made her think about the wedding we'd never had, the vows we'd never exchanged, the life we'd never built together. She'd touched the ring through her dress as she watched her daughter say "I do," honoring both the love she was witnessing and the love she'd preserved. The generosity of spirit required to love so fully in multiple directions while living consciously in the present moment revealed a depth of character I was only beginning to understand. Sarah hadn't just been the girl I'd loved at 25. She'd grown into a woman of remarkable emotional sophistication, someone who'd learned to navigate the complexities of the heart with grace and wisdom that I envied and admired. Margaret's next revelation came when she called to tell me about a conversation she'd had with Robert, Sarah's widowed husband. He'd been more aware of the ring's significance than anyone had realized, not just accepting its presence, but actually encouraging Sarah to honor what it represented. This man, who could have been jealous or threatened by his wife's preserved love for another, had instead chosen compassion and understanding that spoke to the depth of his own character. Robert had told Margaret about a particularly difficult period in their marriage, during their 15th year together, when work stress and parenting challenges had created distance between them. Sarah had been touching the ring more frequently during those months, and Robert had finally asked her to tell him everything about the man who'd given it to her. She'd spent an entire evening sharing our story, and rather than creating jealousy, the conversation had brought them closer together. He told me, Margaret relayed, that understanding how deeply Sarah was capable of loving made him feel more secure in their marriage, not less. He knew that if she could carry love for someone she'd lost for so many years, her love for him, the man she'd chosen to build a life with, must be extraordinarily strong and permanent. The wisdom of Robert's perspective added another dimension to this already complex story of love, loss, and the many forms that devotion can take. There had been moments over the years when Sarah had considered taking the ring off permanently. Robert shared these struggles with Margaret, explaining that Sarah would sometimes feel guilty about her preserved love, worried that it somehow diminished what she could offer her family. During those times, he'd been the one to encourage her to keep wearing it, understanding that trying to erase such a significant part of her emotional history would only create more pain. The most remarkable detail Robert shared was about Sarah's final weeks in the hospital. She'd asked him to make sure the ring was with her always, even during medical procedures. When she grew too weak to wear the chain, he'd held the ring in his palm while holding her hand, ensuring that all three of them, Sarah, Robert, and the memory of our love, were connected during her last days. The image of this man I'd never met honoring our love even as he grieved his wife's impending death revealed a depth of humanity that left me speechless. The later letters, written during Sarah's 50s and 60s, took on a different tone as she aged and gained perspective on the choices she'd made and the love she'd preserved. She'd written about watching romantic movies with Robert and sometimes thinking about how different actors reminded her of me, but she'd also written about how grateful she was for the life she'd actually lived rather than the one she'd imagined with me. Maturity had brought her peace with the complexity of carrying multiple loves. One letter, written on her 60th birthday, contained what felt like a direct conversation across the decades. I wonder if you ever think about what we'd be like now if we'd stayed together. Would we have grown in the same directions? Would we have made it through the challenges that every long marriage faces? I think about this sometimes, but not with regret, more with curiosity about the mystery of human connection and how love changes us over time. She'd written about reading about my teaching career in the local newspaper's coverage of education awards, how proud she'd felt seeing my name in print, how she'd cut out the article and kept it with her other treasured items. She'd wondered if I was happy, if I'd found peace in my solitary life, if I ever regretted not following her when her family moved. These questions, posed decades after they could be answered, created an ache in my chest that felt both fresh and ancient. The letters from her later years also contained more direct messages to me, as if she'd begun to think more seriously about mortality and the possibility that these words might somehow reach me after her death. She'd written about hoping I'd lived a good life, hoping I'd found moments of joy and purpose, even if I'd never found lasting love. Her concern for my well-being, preserved on paper for decades, revealed the constancy of her caring. The final letter in the collection, written just 3 months before her death, contained words that felt like a benediction. "I've loved 2 men in my lifetime, Thomas, and I've been blessed by both loves. Robert has been my companion, my partner, my choice. You have been my wonder, my what if, my reminder that the heart is capable of connections that transcend time and circumstance. If there's another life after this one, I hope I get to see you again, to tell you face to face how much our love meant to me, how it shaped everything beautiful that came after." 3 weeks after reading Sarah's final letter, I made a decision that surprised even me. I booked a flight to the city where she'd lived and died, needing to see the places where she'd spent her adult years while carrying my ring next to her heart. Margaret had offered to show me around, and Robert, incredibly, had invited me to visit their home. The generosity of these people who owed me nothing but understood my need for connection overwhelmed me completely. Robert met me at the airport, a tall, silver-haired man with kind eyes who embraced me like an old friend rather than a potential threat. During the drive to their neighborhood, he talked about Sarah with the easy familiarity of 4 decades together. But he also asked questions about our early relationship with genuine curiosity rather than jealousy. His ability to honor both his marriage and my connection to his wife demonstrated an emotional maturity I'd rarely encountered. Their home was filled with evidence of a life well lived, family photos covering every surface, children's artwork still hanging on the refrigerator, though the kids were now adults with children of their own. Bookshelves lined with volumes that 2 readers had shared over the decades. But Robert also showed me a small shelf in Sarah's study where she'd kept items from her past, including a photo of me that Margaret had sent her years ago and small mementos from our time together. The most sacred moment came when Robert led me to Sarah's jewelry box and showed me the chain that had held my ring for 40 years. The silver had worn smooth from decades of her touch, and seeing it there among her other treasured pieces, her wedding ring, earrings the children had given her, her mother's pearls, I understood how seamlessly she'd integrated all the loves of her life into one coherent whole. That evening, Robert, Margaret, and I sat in Sarah's garden, drinking wine and sharing stories about the woman we'd all loved in different ways. Robert talked about her laugh, her terrible cooking, her fierce protection of her children. I shared memories of her young dreams, her idealism, her way of making ordinary moments feel magical. Together, we created a complete portrait of Sarah's life, from the girl I'd known to the woman she'd become, honoring every phase of her journey. The next morning, Robert took me to the cemetery where Sarah was buried. Her headstone was simple and elegant, listing her birth and death dates along with the words beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. But Robert told me that buried with her, clutched in her hands, was the silver ring that had connected us across 4 decades of separation. In death, she'd finally brought together all the pieces of her heart that she'd kept carefully compartmentalized in life. Standing at her grave, I felt the full weight of understanding what our love had meant and what it had cost us both. We'd preserved something beautiful and pure, but we'd also carried a burden that had shaped every other relationship we'd attempted to form. I'd never married because no one could compete with the idealized memory of our perfect love. Sarah had married and found happiness, but had also lived with the constant awareness of loving in multiple directions simultaneously. Robert left me alone at the graveside for an hour, understanding that I needed private time to say goodbye to the woman I'd never stopped loving, and to finally release the guilt I'd carried for 37 years. I talked to Sarah as if she were standing next to me, telling her about my life, thanking her for the letters, apologizing for my pride that had separated us, expressing gratitude for the love that had sustained me even in its absence. The strangest part of this pilgrimage was realizing that I felt closer to Sarah now, understanding the full scope of our connection, than I ever had when we were actually together. Our young love had been intense but simple. This mature understanding of how she'd honored our relationship while building another life entirely revealed depths of feeling and commitment that our 25-year-old selves couldn't have imagined or sustained. When Robert returned, he handed me a small wrapped package that Sarah had left with specific instructions for Margaret to give to me if I ever came looking for answers about our past. Inside was a photo I'd never seen. Sarah in her wedding dress, radiant and happy, but wearing the chain with my ring visible just above the neckline of her gown. On the back, she'd written, "For Thomas, carried you with me into my new life. You were part of every happy moment. Thank you for loving me enough to let me go." The flight home gave me hours to process everything I'd learned about Sarah's life, her choices, and the love we'd shared across decades of separation. I understood now that our connection had been far more complex and enduring than the simple narrative of young love lost that I'd carried for so many years. She'd found a way to honor multiple truths simultaneously, loving Robert completely while never forgetting me, building a family while preserving a private space for memories, living fully in her chosen present while maintaining connection to her past. Her example challenged me to reconsider my own choices and the story I told myself about remaining single as a tribute to our lost love. Had I been honoring our connection, or had I been hiding from the vulnerability required to love again? Sarah had proven that the heart was capable of expanding rather than simply replacing, but I'd chosen the safer path of preservation rather than the riskier journey of growth and new possibility. The letters had revealed not just Sarah's enduring love for me, but also her growth into a woman of remarkable emotional intelligence who'd learned to navigate complexity with grace. She'd sought therapy when needed, communicated honestly with her husband, and found ways to integrate all parts of herself into a coherent whole. I'd remained static, frozen in time, while she'd evolved and flourished while still maintaining connection to her past.
Connection to our shared past. But I also realized that my preservation of our love had been its own form of gift to her. Knowing that I'd never married, never replaced her completely, had given her permission to maintain her own connection to our relationship. We'd been unknowing partners in this decades-long dance of memory and devotion, each of us providing the other with the space to honor what we'd shared, even while building separate lives. The most profound revelation was understanding that Sarah's death didn't end our connection, it completed it. For 40 years, we'd loved each other across distance and silence, maintaining faith in something that existed primarily in memory and hope. Now, finally, I knew the full scope of that shared devotion. The story that had seemed unfinished for so long had revealed itself to be perfectly complete. A love that had transcended time, space, marriage, family, and even death itself. 6 months have passed since my pilgrimage to Sarah's hometown, and I find myself living differently now, approaching each day with awareness of the preciousness of time and connection that I'd previously taken for granted. The knowledge that Sarah carried our love with her every day for 40 years has changed how I understand not just our relationship, but the nature of love itself. True love, I've learned, isn't diminished by time or distance or even other loves. It simply exists, constant and enduring, shaping us in ways we might never fully comprehend. I've begun reaching out to friends I'd lost touch with over the years, understanding now that isolation isn't a tribute to lost love, but a waste of the connections that remain available to us. Sarah's ability to love fully in multiple directions has inspired me to be more open to the people in my life, more present for the relationships that still have room to grow and deepen. At 72, I'm discovering that it's never too late to choose connection over solitude. The silver ring that connected Sarah and me across 4 decades now rests in a place of honor on my mantelpiece, returned to me by Robert with his blessing. Sometimes I hold it and think about the hands it graced for so many years, the heart it hung closest to, the love it represented through decades of ordinary days and extraordinary moments. It's become a talisman not of loss, but of the incredible capacity of the human heart to maintain faith in love even when circumstances seem to defeat it. Margaret calls regularly now, sharing stories about Sarah's children and grandchildren, keeping me connected to the family that grew from the woman I loved. Robert has become an unexpected friend, someone who understands the complexity of loving the same person in different ways and different times. We've created our own small community of people who were touched by Sarah's remarkable capacity for love and who are committed to honoring her memory by living with the same openness and generosity of spirit she demonstrated. These touching, real stories of love after 50 remind us that emotional stories don't end with youth, that second chances can come in forms we never expected, and that heartbreak and memory can transform into wisdom and connection. Sarah and I shared a lost love that became a found understanding, a relationship that matured across decades of separation into something more beautiful and complete than we could have created if we'd never been apart. If you've been moved by this story of how true love never dies, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to hear more life reflections and real stories about the many forms that love can take. Like this video if Sarah's story touched your heart, and let me know in the comments about your own experiences with enduring love and second chances. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that take decades to fully reveal their meaning.